This is the second lecture for week 7, and in this lecture we'll talk about the social context of childcare, which is an important context for children where they start to form their first peer relationships. They have an opportunity for play, which is what we'll talk about in the next lecture, and they have important relationships also with their teachers. So the lecture begins with a definition of what we mean by childcare or early childhood education and care, and then discusses what is quality early childhood education and care, and then just to very briefly just mentioning a few of the research studies that have been done on outcomes that are associated with high quality early childhood education and care. So by early childhood education and care, I mean long daycare. We know when children are at a daycare center while their parents are working, which can go, from really early in the morning. I worked somewhere where they were opened at 6 a.m. until, later in the evening. And sometimes childcare centers are even open for swing shift people and even on, evenings, weekends. So that long daycare experience. Family daycare, which is when someone is providing care within their home, and preschool. And preschool tends to have, more of that preparation for kindergarten and primary school feel to it. So children will start to, get prepared by, learning colors, developing school readiness skills in terms of early literacy skills. So that's what we're talking about. So the quality of early childhood education and care really comes from how children are provided with nurturing relationships. So these are relationships with teachers where teachers are individualizing the care for children. They're getting to know the child and trying to support the development of that individual child. And it's also about teachers supporting positive relationships between children and their peers. It's also about giving children stimulating environments, so environments where they can engage with materials and run around, so engaging with materials like to develop fine motor skills, which are those when you, for example, do something, manipulate something with your hands, using a crayon or pushing a button. Those are the fine motor skills. And then the gross motor skills are when you're running around and using the big muscles, letting children jump and run and be vigorous like that. So it's good to have a mix of those kinds of environments and opportunities, and then also having basic health and safety so that the space is safe for children to explore. And high quality care promotes positive outcomes. So it includes things like positive, good impacts on language acquisition, where children are, developing their vocabularies, emotional regulation, which we talked about in the previous lecture, as children learn to bring their emotions under control. So when they get really upset, how do they handle those kinds of emotions? Sociability, where the children are beginning to develop social competence in their relationships with their peers and, learning to get along with others. Creativity, where children are having some freedom to create using paint and other kinds of medium, to kind of have that freedom to explore. And then conflict resolution skills, because conflict is inevitable, particularly among young children. They'll fight over a toy or want to take the lead in play. So helping children learn how you handle conflict with a peer. So caregivers are working on those outcomes, and they're doing that through socialization, which we talked about in week 3. So, for example, teachers can socialize children using the observational method, where the teacher is modeling something, like how do you handle conflict resolution skills, and they show, okay, give the toy back to the child, and now apologize. The part of that is also giving direct instruction, which is the cognitive method. So again, teachers can model in their own behavior some of these outcomes. They can model language, for example, teach children this is the word for this, and use various words. They can use the cognitive method to give direct instruction. This is how you resolve a conflict, or this is how you make friends, for example. Or they can also use the operant method, for example. So they can reward with praise children being sociable and being sharing with their friends, or they can praise when children are handling their emotions in a positive way. I see you got really upset when he took that toy, but you went over and you got another toy. So that was really good. So that's the operant method of positive feedback, or positive reinforcement rather. So all these ways are ways that high quality early childhood education and care can impact positively on children's outcomes. And when people are talking about quality in terms of early childhood services, they typically are referring to one of two things: structure and process. So structure in terms of quality is around the characteristics of that setting of the service and the caregivers. So it's the things that you can easily observe around the child-adult ratios, how many children are there per adult, and having fewer children per adult is associated with higher quality. Group sizes, so even if you have several adults, it's better to have smaller groups, just it's less chaotic, as you can imagine. So if you have a group that has 12 children, or you have compared to a group that has 25 children, it's going to have a different energy. And then teacher qualifications and wages are also associated with quality. So when teachers are trained in the early years, as students learn here, there's a degree program in the early years, they learn a lot about children's development, how they can support positive development, and being more highly educated around child development is associated with more positive, high quality care. And then when teachers are paid more, it's also associated with better care, which is not surprising. The other element of quality is the child's experience of care. So, this is a bit more nebulous. It's about what the experience of care feels like for that individual child. So it's about how responsive is the caregiver. So are they responding to the child's cues when they're expressing some kind of need? Like with parents, we've talked about how parents' responsiveness to children's needs forms the foundation for attachment in the first year of life in particular. And that's true of other caregiver relationships for children. So when caregivers are responsive to children's needs, a feeling of trust and security is established. And it's also about individualizing care. So getting to know the individual child, and I'll say more in a moment about temperament. So it's about what's this child bringing to their experience and what do they need? How can I help support this child in terms of their development? So caregiver interactions with children, we've talked about this concept of goodness and fit. And so we've talked about goodness of fit in terms of the temperament of a child and their parent. And it's also important in terms of what's going on in a setting like childcare. So children have temperament, as we talked about in week 5. It's something we're all born with, that has this genetic component, and part of it comes from also the environment. But it's a natural part of how we express ourselves and how we respond to new situations. And so it can be really hard to change, and it's important for caregivers to be sensitive and aware of the child's temperament, and not punish the child when they've got a temperament, where could be some kind of friction. So children should not be punished, for example, if they're high intensity and they are loud when they get upset. So that's a natural reaction for a child who's high intensity, is to kind of be loud and boisterous. So can you manage those behaviors rather than the child for how they are naturally? Or if a child is low in rhythmicity, which is about the sort of the body rhythms, and they're not hungry every lunchtime, and they're not tired every nap time, you don't need to punish a child for that. It's not their fault, right? Or if a child is low in adaptability, where they have trouble or they're slow in terms of finishing an activity and transitioning to a new one, you don't want to call them names or taunt them or something. So unfortunately this happens, but it's an important marker of quality is when caregivers are sensitive to the temperaments of the children that they work with, and they work with the temperament. They didn't go against the grain. They try to support that child, knowing who that child really is. And then the last thing I want to mention in this lecture, and then we'll pick up on peer relationships in the next lecture, is about the long-term impacts of high-quality early childhood education and care. And there's been a really powerful body of research that has established that if children have high-quality education and care, particularly children who are from disadvantaged backgrounds, it's associated with positive outcomes when they are adults. And so this research, there are 3 studies that are often cited. So in policy reports that are trying to encourage the expansion of preschool, or even in the proposal that was put forward for Early Start, which I've read here at the University of Wollongong, they cite these 3 studies. So these were 3 very powerful studies that showed through an experimental longitudinal design that if you have an early childhood experience with high quality education and care, and there's also a family support component for these 3 studies, that is associated with better outcomes for children. So I mentioned these 3 studies here. One is the high scope Perry preschool study, which was done in the New York State. The other was the Carolina Abecedarian Project, which was done in North Carolina, and the Chicago Parent Child Centers in Chicago, Illinois. So these were 3 American studies with highly disadvantaged populations. And so there is a question around how generalizable are the findings if you say, hey, let's do what they did, but here in Australia. But these, all the same, they've been very powerful because what happened was these were experimental studies where a group of disadvantaged children were sort of assembled, and then they were randomly assigned either to high quality early childhood education and care with a family support component or nothing. And then both groups were followed. So the nothing group may have gotten their own thing going, but basically the intervention for the experiment was, what's it like if a child is exposed to really high quality care in the early years and they come from a disadvantaged background, what happens? And then they followed the cohorts of children who got the intervention, who got the high quality child care experience, and those children who did not, over time. And so some of these studies were done like in the late 1970s, and so they have a lot of data actually in terms of the development, and these are adults now, the children who participated in these programs, and they found better adult outcomes for those children who did participate in high quality education and care compared to the control group. So the children who were in the treatment group, they have better outcomes in terms of more likely to be employed, more likely to have good positive relationships like being married. And then the children who didn't receive the treatment were more likely to be incarcerated and be in jail, more likely to be dependent on welfare benefits, more likely to have a teen pregnancy. So, in terms of looking at outcomes, it seems like there's a protective factor that's introduced by having high quality early childhood education and care. But quality is very important. So that's why I've been trying to describe quality in this lecture. It's not enough just to get children some kind of early childhood, preschool kind of experience. It has to be high quality. So we're going to continue talking about early childhood and the experience of children with their peers and with play in the 3rd lecture.